So welcome everyone. I'm extremely excited to introduce and then moderate a fireside chat with Glen Coppersmith, who is a triple Husky. He earned a bachelor's in computer science and cognitive psychology in 2003, a master's in psycholinguistics in 2005, and a doctorate in neuroscience in 2008, all from Northeastern. He's the founder and CEO of Qntfy, which is a software company that is dedicated to the intersection of computer science and human behavior. His work has been covered in several major publications, including The Today Show, Mashable, The Mighty, and Scientific American. And in 2019, I was delighted to present Glen with the Outstanding Alumnus Award. Glen.
Thank you for having me, and it's wonderful. I couldn't have asked for a better set of people to hang out with, and Carla to have a chance to chat with you. So I appreciate this. It seems like every time that we have a chance to get together, there's a lot of laughter, despite the serious subject matter that we discuss, and we get into some really interesting topics. So I appreciate your willingness to do this with us.
So Glen, are you going to talk a little bit about your work first, and then we'll get into more of a question and answer period. So can you talk about how you combine computer science to help with mental health?
Yeah, so there's briefly what Qntfy has done is sort of an outgrowth of the work that we started years ago, in fact, as an undergrad, sort of combining computer science and psychology. And so a lot of the work that my career has been around is understanding how do we use computational techniques to understand human behavior. And so my undergraduate work was just getting the foundations for that. And then sort of through grad school, I was applying those techniques to try to understand psycholinguistics and then the maladaptive aggression, which is code for people that are being particularly violent, which we're actually not very good at understanding. And this opened up a whole space of very interesting questions where I realized that doing my doctorate work, we ended up with some pretty big holes in our understanding and holes in our ability to quantify. I get a nickel every time anyone uses Qntfy, just so we're clear. I still have about 25 cents. That ends up, but finding ways to quantify human behavior in a way we can actually study it. And that the whole field of psychology has made tremendous progress with sort of limited tools, right? Paper and pencil and people self-disclosing and talking about their recollections and their experiences. And they've done a yeoman's job of trying to figure out how do we quantify this and how do we make sense of it? How do we find structure in this wicked mass of everything it is mental health and well-being? But just recently, we have this ability to really start quantifying things on a much greater scale. We have this ability to look at digital life data. This is the sort of what the largest bulk of my time has been spent doing. But for every day that we're interacting with the digital device, we're creating trails of whatever it is that we're doing here. And so like we're on the Zoom call and there's somebody's recording it. And there's a chunk of our digital life that is being captured here in this moment. And this is a pretty bad example of particularly great stuff we might be able to do here to understand mental health and well-being, because everyone is going to be great and have lots of laughs and lots of fun here today. So perhaps not totally representative of what everyone is going through. But there's a lot of other aspects of digital life that are present there. And so some of the obvious ones, the ones we've published a lot on, are things like using social media data and language. So much of our communication is happening via textual communication. We're typing things in or typing things in as your scheme might be. And in that moment, you are taking what is a very amorphous and difficult to measure signal, your brain, your feelings, your emotions, your plans, and putting it into a form that is capturable and in some ways quantifiable. And so this is the sort of the overarching thesis here, is that the language gives us a beautiful lens into a person's psyche, a person's well-being, a person's mental health, and a person's emotions in a way that we didn't have before. And so what sort of grew out of a bunch of that work was coming to realize that by taking machine learning and natural language processing and psycholinguistics, and then using language as one of these many signals that are being captured over the course of our life, we have a chance to actually quantify and really understand in a very different, deeper way the psychology and mental health and well-being than we did before. And so, taking something like somebody's wearables, we can understand sleep at a way that's way better than a sleep journal, where someone's writing down how they slept last night. Taking information from a person's social media gives us a sense to really understand, like, how are they connected to a community? What gets them angry? And everything in between, right? And so this general capability, this ability to look at digital life data and connect it to mental health and well-being, is actually only a slight shift from marketing. And so what we at Qntfy have been doing is, it turns out, reinventing and relearning a bunch of the things that the marketing and ad agencies have already learned as to how do we analyze your data and understand your behavior. We would like to do it for good. Other people might have other motives, but that's the sort of the core thesis of what we're doing previously, and now taking this and applying this in a way that is meaningful and ethical and pragmatic. So I know we're going to get into a bunch of discussion around those things today, surely. But this core piece of technology really comes down to, how do I use all the computer science, machine learning training that I've had, and a keen understanding of mental health and well-being in humans, and how do we actually get better at helping people? And one of the biggest learnings that came out of all that, we're very good at identifying people that are at risk and identifying diagnoses and things like this. And we can talk about exactly what that means. But ultimately, the thing that I thought was going to be the hardest problem in all of this was in finding the people who are having trouble and understanding that. And in fact, that was totally naive of me, right? The real challenges lie in, how do we use that information to improve their lives? How do we use that information to affect the human system that is around them, that cares for them? How do we use that information and give it back to them in a way that's meaningful? How do we use that information to give it to researchers in a way that they can make progress in sort of global understanding? And how do we use that information to give it back to the clinicians who might be caring for a person? And so this is the set of the really interesting problems that we sort of spend our time thinking about and attacking. But that's just as a quick way of introduction there. So we're taking a bunch of the computational techniques, we're analyzing humans, and now we have these really interesting questions that I don't know what to do, and that's okay. There's a lot of really great problems there. And so I know there's a lot of people from a diversity of backgrounds listening today. But I hope we can get into some of the really interesting ways in which this touches not just on mental health and well-being, but the sort of more broad concerns around what are the big questions in computer science and in computational social science, things like this, that we can be addressing today. And what are the things that are on your mind we might be able to do something about?
So Glenn, I'm gonna share something personal with the entire audience. So my oldest son is very open about that he has rapid cycling bipolar disorder. He's doing fantastic. He's doing an MFA at American Film Institute in Hollywood, where he's hoping to make films that are more realistic about people who are both blessed and suffer from mental illness. Blessed because he's wildly creative, because the thing that makes your brain process emotions really quickly is usually comorbid or co-existent with something that makes you really smart, actually. So he now looks at his own mental illness with both the positive and the negative, which I think is really well balanced, and he's very open about it because it's been stigmatized. So Glenn, and by the way, my son has spoken with Glenn because he was fascinated by this research. And certainly I'll just say, from a personal viewpoint, again, just that I can tell from the way he writes emails and texts whether or not he's in a bad place. So that brings me to a very specific question. I want to get to a question about your journey to where you are, but it gets me to a very specific question, which is, when you analyze all the text in someone's social media, what is actually a predictor that someone is really not doing very well?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's one or two questions that we always start off with. It's either the privacy concerns or that. And so I'm happy to start here too. These are the big questions on everybody's mind. And I appreciate you sharing a bit about your son. Your son is fantastic, and I agree, super creative. right? There's something really, the fact that we have approached these things as though it is an illness as opposed to something that is different, is differentially capable, is really an interesting and a powerful way of thinking about this differently. We are just processing things differently, all of us. So to get back to your question there, when we're looking at some of this data, we're looking at what are the signals that are emergent here. Let's go back in history just a little bit. There's some really fantastic work that was done by Jamie Pennebaker at University of Austin. I know maybe we shouldn't mention the other universities here, but I don't think he's a rival. He's a great friend of everybody's. But he did work early on building analysis of language, building psychometrically validated dictionaries where you could look at the words that are being said, and a concept like saying something about blood evokes a psychological concept of trauma. Death evokes a psychological concept of trauma. And likewise, I and we are pronouns in some meaningful way, and those represent something slightly different. So he has analyzed language. He's tried to quantify, Nickel for me, he's tried to quantify language in some meaningful ways by when these words are showing up and what proportion of your words are being used in one way or another. So how often are you saying I versus we? And so this is the sort of thing that we're finding at a much broader scale. And so he did this as a closed class. He used psychological knowledge to identify the meaningful words. We're using machine learning to show us what are the differences between the people that are diagnosed with depression and those that are not, and what are the systematic differences that are present there. And so what emerges from that are some of the same things that he found. And so there's signals there that we can talk about, and then a whole bunch of stuff that makes sense, and then a whole bunch of stuff that we don't really know what to make of it. And so this is actually the power of a lot of this work, is to say, here's some very well psychometrically validated, here's some face valid, and then here's a bunch of stuff that's teaching us something. That's teaching us something. And so the signals that come out of these sorts of things are tens of thousands of signals, like most machine learning algorithms. And it's super, super diffuse. And so let me tell you some of the things that are totally useless in predicting something like suicide. I'm going to kill myself. Totally useless. Worse than useless. Right? It gives you no signal whatsoever because it's used so frequently. And so the things that are actually more interesting and more telling of risk are like the way and the frequency with which people are using words about emotions, and the way in which they're describing their emotions. There's some face validity to that, right? You can think about how intense emotions are sometimes correlated with things related to risk. And so now this kind of makes some sense, right? If you're going to say you're morose instead of sad, there's a slight differentiation there, and there's some meaning captured in there. And likewise, the frequency with which you're saying I versus we. I is a insular, you're doing something alone perhaps, and you're doing something with a group. Or you're introspecting, which is another classic aspect of depression. And so the point of all of this is this is a very, very diffuse signal. And so you can say I, and you can say morose and not be at risk. It's really the preponderance of signals across time, across all, the ways in which you write generally, that really give us the power of prediction and understanding. I hope that's helpful. Mm-hmm.
That was really great. I'm going to now delve a little bit into your journey, because I think it's really interesting, the journey that you took to get to where you currently are. So I'm going to ask you a bunch of sort of short answer questions. So how did your Northeastern journey start? What made you decide to do a combined major in computer science and cognitive psychology?
So the joke at the time was that I wanted to design the perfect girlfriend. That was the joke. It was clearly not the case. The true motivation was that I loved Tetris. I really wanted to understand, surely we can play Tetris. And surely there's an algorithm to this, but it's not a simple algorithm. And so this is like, no joke, the way in which I really got started here is I started off as a computer science major, but realized that the AI course was the capstone of this combination of computer science and psychology. And so the ability to put those two things together, well, why don't we study both these things? That sounds great. And little did I realize you guys had just turned this major on as I was getting there. And so I got to be one of the first ones doing it, and just incredible foresight given where the field has ended up. And so this really came down to, could we build an AI to play Tetris? And the spoiler is that was my capstone project in AI. And for at least a little while, my roommate James Dennis and I had a world record for how good we were at playing Tetris with our little AI.
So that's
It's
really
fun
funny.
if anybody hasn't done that.
Oh, I was going to say in grad school, which is like before most of the people on this call were born, I played a lot of Tetris. And at one point I was the champion in my grad school until someone else went in and hacked it and actually just moved themselves up in the ranking. And we were like, how did he get 10,000? Because like the best was like something like 8,000, which shows you that I was not really being that productive and should have used your system. So, I want to get to, you founded Qntfy in 2015 after 10 years of academic research. Where did the idea for opening your business come from? What made you do this?
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. So I was at Johns Hopkins University for a good long while there, studying at the Center for Language and Speech Processing and a couple of other related pieces there. And so we were analyzing, using the computational linguistics information that we had and trying to do better at understanding human speech, human text. When humans touch computers with language, what does that look like? And one of the things that I realized, a friend of mine, Meg Mitchell, was running a conference about mental health and well-being. And this interest that you're right, this sort of the thing that I've adopted in my core philosophy here around using language to understand mental health and well-being. And so she was like, "Hey, Glenn, I know you've got a psych major. You don't tell anybody that you're a psych major. Everyone thought I was a computer scientist, and I'm happy to take that. But like, could you please write a paper for this thing? I have no idea what it's going to look like, but like, this is I want to make sure someone at least submits something to this conference." And like, she was so right. There's so much interesting work there. And so we did a little bit of work using the techniques we had already been developing and looking at post-traumatic stress. And so why is that particularly interesting? I've done a bunch of work with the Department of Defense and have many veteran friends, one of which came back from Iraq and was not quite the same. And you could tell from reading his Facebook post that he was not quite the same. And I had this, a bit of an epiphany after looking at some of this stuff and starting to do some of this work that like, I wish someone would be able to find the people that are at risk and get them the help. And so I naively thought that finding the people that are at risk is the difficult part. In fact, it's the getting effective help that's the difficult challenge here. That there is still a data portion to. But this then quickly spiraled. As I was writing this first paper, I looked up the statistics, and the number of people that are dying from mental health related causes is tremendous compared to almost anything else that was in my purview to affect. And the thing that really struck me is the disability adjusted life years. I don't know if anybody of you are familiar with this, but this is a way in which you can calculate the amount of impact that a disease has on a population. And so this is something like, if you are at 80% capacity because you have depression for the rest of your life, we have removed a chunk of your life, right? 20% of the remaining time of your life has been removed. This is a really interesting way of looking at this, of sort of global suffering. And so disability adjusted life years on mental health stuff is huge. So in writing the introductions to these papers, it was like, this is the problem that we should be looking at. It's gigantic, and nobody has any data. Nobody really understands what's going on here, because all this stuff is based on self-disclosure. All this stuff is based on the best that the psychologist could do. And so I foolishly was like, surely there is a company here. No, it turns out like there is, maybe, but you got to work really hard and squint really hard at it to get there. But the epiphany really came from being asked to put something together and then actually looking at the size of the problem, and it was just outsized. And yet here we are having some really interesting techniques and some interesting insight. 5 years later, we're finally starting to understand some things.
So Glenn, I'm going to ask you a little bit about some of the actual details, but I want to start with the people. I think you were quite surprised by the large group of people who were willing to participate in your studies, because obviously Glenn needs to collect the data of people who are suffering from whatever mental illness that they're suffering from. Could be PTSD, could be depression, could be whatever, and also people who are not. And so that, because for those of you that are taking or will take machine learning, you can't learn to discriminate between normal versus people who are feeling not good unless you have examples of both. So can you talk about how did you go about collecting the data of people who aren't feeling good? And were you surprised by, I mean, obviously you've had enough people volunteer that you could do the research. So could you talk a little bit about how you recruited them and what happened with that?
Yeah, this is one of those unsuspected challenges. I didn't think that this was going to be, and yet a wonderful boon over the course of this journey. So when we started off working, I should straight up front say, when we were thinking about doing this work in those early days, almost immediately we went to the potential dual use of this technology that might came out of it. And so Mark Dredzy and one of his, Adrian Benton and I wrote a paper about the ethical framework that we use to approach this thing. And this is actually critically important because all this could be dangerous in the wrong hands. And we think that we're in the right hands, but you make your judgment if you need to. Where we really looked at this is to say, if we're going to build something that tells you if someone is at risk, how should we be thinking about this? How do we identify those people? And then two, how ought one use it? And so this is important as we get started thinking about the things I'm about to tell you. And so when we were approaching this, the first place that we could think to get data is not to ask people, because I don't know enough people, but to go look at public data and to find people that are publicly disclosing and talking about mental health conditions. And so a lot of this research got started looking at public social media posts where someone said the effect of, I'm diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, or I've been diagnosed with depression. And so this allowed us to listen to people who were publicly talking about their mental health conditions. This is a biased sample, just so we're clear, right? But it's a sample that gives us some place to start. And so what we did was collect this data, these public self-statements of mental health and eventually suicide risk. And we're able to look at and find matched controls in a similar way, which gave us the ability to get started here. So that's phase one of this, was starting with public self-stated diagnoses. Phase two, which is far more interesting, and I think a lot of what you're getting at, is we launched the Our Data Helps project. We realized we didn't actually have enough deep information about history and things that people are not talking about on social media. There's some of that. And so how do we ask some of those questions? And so what we did find is there are people, especially the suicide prevention community, lived experience community within the suicide world, was just unbelievably embracing of the work that we're doing, because we're able to shine the light on things in a way that traditional academics had not. And so what we had routinely been asked is, how can I help? I have data, right? I attempted suicide on X date. How can I give you my data? Which was not really what I expected, but in fact, that's the case. And so we turned on this Our Data Helps project. So ourdatahelps.org is a place that people can go and donate their data and then fill out a short questionnaire and give us the ability to, we take that data, we de-identify it, we do our research with it, and we share it with academics and university people that have an ROV approved study, and allows them to analyze that data. So we've actually unlocked a whole bunch of potential in the research community by doing this. And by we, I mean the people who are willing to donate their data. And so we've had more than 5,000 people donate their data. And so, as you suggested, not all of them are at risk for any given condition. A bunch of them are matched controls as well. But it's been a really interesting journey there. And when we talk about this, right, this is a place where no one is concerned about privacy. They have deliberately opted in. We've been very disclosing of what we're doing with it. We're taking your data, we're de-identifying it, we're giving it to people, not publicly, but we're giving it to the researchers who can use this to make a difference. And the response from the community has been tremendous support, which has been, so the way in which we recruited this was a little strange. And so in all these cases, these are biased, and these are best used together to sort of counteract the biases that are involved with either one of them.
It's amazing. So, getting to more recent stresses on all of us, I know everybody is having a hard time. It's, we've been in a pandemic. We have had a lot of stress created by the systemic racism in our country. And then, of course, by what looks to be a really large divide in fundamental beliefs of what is a democracy in our country and who should lead our country. I mean, we're pretty much not quite split down the middle, but we are split as a country. And so I know, Glenn, at the start of the pandemic, you launched Qntfy-ing, which is a mental health application for frontline healthcare professionals to track their own personal behavior and overall wellness. Talk to us about that and what you've been able to do with that.
Yeah, this has been something that we've been building for a while, quietly, trying to get it right before we put it too far out into the real world. And at the start of this pandemic, we all sort of looked at each other and it's like, here's something that we can do that can be helpful. And so we should just turn this on. It's not quite ready for prime time, but there's something that it can do that can be helpful here. And so Quinn has been our at a sort of 10,000 foot view. Quinn was our answer to how do I take your data and give it back to you in ways that's meaningful. And that doesn't actually end up looking like me handing you charts and stuff. It looks like me using that to inform the messages that I'm going to send you. And so Quinn, the interaction that a person has with Quinn is that they get text messages right now. There's not even an app, right? You've signed up and you've opted in for us to send you supportive messages. And so we launched this without any of the data collection components for the healthcare workers, because we were initially just testing retention. Are people willing to let us send them text messages a couple times a day? The answer seems like resoundingly yes, for seemingly unending, right? There's no one who has used Quinn for more than 6 months that's turned it off. And we're talking about a couple of years worth of data for some of these people.
What kind of text messages do you send?
Yeah, well, I think this is part of the key, right? We'll send you a fun quote, we'll send you a piece of humor, we'll send you something inspiring. Maybe we'll send you a little bit of psychoeducation here occasionally, but the intention of all this was to be like helpful and supportive and inspirational, and maybe a little bit of veggies with that. And so we do some clever scoring on the back end where people react to the quotes, and we have the ability to sort of tailor it to you, which I think is part of the key here. So we have one guy who loves knock jokes and nobody else seems to like knock jokes. Well, you know what? Like, he's optimized for the knock jokes and he gets them. And I don't know that anybody else does. And so what, yeah. But what that's ended up doing is we've had a chance to engage with people. These are in particular, I'm going to talk about the healthcare workers for a second here. At this moment, as the pandemic was really taking off and they were really concerned about everything. And so upon intake to signing up for Quinn, we asked you, like, which of these quotes resonate with you to get a baseline for the sorts of things we might want to share with you. And then we asked them a couple of questions in a very hands-off, light way. And so some of the things that showed up there is we asked them, listen, here's some modules we're thinking about building in terms of that psychoeducation. Which of these would you resonate with? And almost everyone was like, yeah, I want help sleeping. Clearly, that's a demand signal across the board that people are having trouble sleeping. And the second was stress management. And third was focus. And so these are things that are they're nothing specific to the healthcare workers. That's sort of generic needs and ways in which we could make some psychoeducation that might help. But here's the thing that really shocked me. We then said, here's some other deeper psychological stuff that we're thinking about building. Does any of this resonate? Does anybody want this? And so one of the questions that we asked after this phrased, I might not get the phrasing quite right, but it was effectively support for your thoughts of suicide. 18% of the people said that they wanted that, which is twice the rate that people would have expected by chance if you were looking at people that had suicidal ideation. And that assumes that all the people that had suicidal ideation were actually signing up for it. So this probably means the problem is worse than we were expecting in the healthcare workers, and they're actually willing. They've asked for support here. So there's a couple of things like this, but that was the one that's sort of most shocking. And so here's the general scheme here is that we have been forthright about what we're going to do, and we've asked for permission before we did anything. And so here we are. Would you like help with this? If so, I'm happy to provide it. And if not, no worries. Take some quotes, take some humor, and enjoy yourself, right? As much as you can during a pandemic, but get some support in this lightweight way. And so that was a tremendously interesting finding here. And now we're working on ways to make the product out of that we had always intended, and get it to a wider audience.
So I'm going to open it partially up to questions, but I reserve the right to ask another question myself. And what I'd love is for people to unmute to ask their questions rather than have me read it, if you're comfortable. If you're not, just put it in the chat that you'd like me to ask the question, which is fine. So I'm going to call on Clayton. I apologize, I didn't give you the chance to opt out of turning on your video. You can quickly send me an email and say no, but Clayton, could you ask your first question, Clayton Bailey?
Yeah, so hi, Glenn. We met back in 2017 a couple times. I'm curious to hear more about the complexities of the privacy issues, and you'd started touching on them a little bit. Sounds like users are willing to go along with the services, provide data. Are there any methods that you have that are needed to convince users to do that? Or what other privacy concerns do you have? Are there data storage issues?
Yeah, those are some great ones. Good to see you again. Thanks for the question. That's a nice meaty one. So there's a handful of things we can touch on there. So we have built some back-end infrastructure that is doing de-identification to some extent. And the plans that we have in place, this is not fully done yet, but there are ways in which we can effectively throw away raw data as soon as it hits our data stores, put it through a transform, a non-recoverable transform, and operate off of that. And so that's not fully in place yet, but we have designs on doing some of that work. But what we do have in terms of backend protection there is that we're separating a bunch of the identifiable information from the raw data, which allows us to separate these two things. And commercial best practices are present there.
Is that also compliant with things like GDPR? Yeah,
because we can still identify and remove people from the data sets as needed and things like that. They're up to date with the privacy standards that I'm aware of. It's distinctly possible that something else has happened during the election or something. Like there's always new things that are happening there as a moving target. But to the best of our ability, like it seems like we're still up to date there. And it's actually interesting, like that wasn't like we had to do something retrospectively. There was stuff that was sort of built in for the ways in which we were thinking about this. Right, this is sort of the core, having started from an ethical standpoint, having started from a idea of how do I best support the users in this. It really saved us a lot of headache in this, here, where we don't have to go back and rethink and re-engineer everything because we were already there. We were already thinking about it. The correlated piece is do I actually do anything to get people to opt in? I haven't had a ton of trouble there, but also let's collect some more data, right? This is always a moving target. And I should say a little bit about the philosophy here. Most apps, when you install them, ask for all the permissions up front. Give me access to everything, right? Now we're taking the opposite approach here, where we're actually saying, don't give me anything, right? Tell me how you react to these quotes, right? Something super, super light. And let me demonstrate some value to you. And then the intention here is to ask them, listen, do you want help with any of these things? If you want help with your sleep, if you're willing to opt in like an Oura Ring or a Fitbit, that's super helpful for us to actually do that well. And so would you be willing to give us access to this data now that we've known each other for a couple of weeks, now that we have the ability to have established some trust, and now that there's a good reason that I want that data, because I want it to turn around and hand it back to you in some meaningful way, not that I'm going to take it and sell it to the advertisers. That is a paradigm that seems to work well, but that's a small n statement. And so it's this gradual establishment and use of trust to get access to data rather than install it and give me access to everything right up front or don't use the app at all. That also means that they can opt in what they want to and not all the things. Sorry, Carla, go ahead.
No. I was just going to invite the next person to ask a question. Christopher Kelly, could you please ask your question next?
Everybody, I think you can see me. So thanks for
and everyone, can you say like what your degree is in or what you're studying? Because I think that's really interesting as well. So sorry.
Yes. So I'm actually an alum from the College of Social Science and Humanities from 2010. So I did political science, and I think that tech is this great vehicle to kind of affect so much change, and so it's great to kind of see events like this. So the question that I asked is, what advice do you have and what resources are there for people that are struggling with mental health related to the pandemic? My sense is that some people are struggling for the first time. Some of them, this is kind of making it worse. And, how should I, as kind of an ally, be supportive and resource them? And what are some of the things that you would say in the language that you would use?
Oh, that's a great one. Thanks for that, Chris. there's no good single answer there. And this is part of the difficulty of this field. There's a lot of stuff out there, and I can't tell you what's going to work for you particularly, right? This particular person, what's the thing that resonates with you is actually a very difficult question right now, and not well enough studied. So what I would say as an ally, if you're trying to help people out there, telling them that even if one thing didn't work, or if one therapist didn't work, to try another one. That there is this personalization factor that we as a field are not very good at yet. And so having some tenacity, and also being willing to say, listen, this isn't working for me. Like, it's okay to say, no thanks, I'm going to go somewhere else, because that therapist time, for example, would be, there is someone who that person is going to be able to help. And if it's not you, the best thing that you can do is to find the person who will help you and allow them to help the person that they're best going to help. And so the greatest example here is around religion, right? If you are a very religious person and your therapist is not, that may not work out particularly well. And then vice versa, right? If religion is very important to your therapist and that's somehow engaged within that, but that's not important to you, this may not be the best match. So that the tenacity and the giving support to the people to make sure that they do try out different things is the best thing that you can do as in support there. And the other thing to look at is there evidence base behind whatever they're talking about? And so there's so many apps that are out there that implement CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, in some meaningful way. Have they done it well? I don't know, right? You can look at the evidence base. There is great evidence base for CBT. And the trouble is that many of the apps claim that they have evidence base for their app having implemented CBT, when in fact the evidence base that they're citing is that CBT itself works not the way in which they've created and instituted and implemented CBT. And so it's a difficult space there, but at least looking for what the evidence is behind one of these platforms or the interventions they're talking about is a good metric that at least gives you a sense that there is some science behind it. And I should say there's plenty of great CBT apps that have implemented CBT but have not run the clinical trial. And that shouldn't disqualify them because it takes years to run some of those clinical trials. And so the tenacity and look for some evidence that this is doing something useful. I hope that's helpful there, Chris.
And thanks, Glenn. And I would add, as someone who had to try really hard to find help for my own child, the waiting lists are fierce. And because it is so person specific, who's going to be helpful, if your friend is having challenges, have them make appointments with 3 people, because if you do one and then decide, no, not for me, then you have to get in the queue again. And it can take several months to get into somebody's queue. So I'm a big believer in multitasking things. Robert, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Glenn, for coming on. This was like super interesting so far. So I have a background, my undergrad was in neuroscience before I started studying computer science. So I obviously find this really interesting. But my question relates more towards bridging the gap between the qualitative data that you take in and the sort of quantitative insights that you're drawing from it. So sometimes in neuroscience and even in other like psychology adjacent areas, people talk about studying things like beauty and emotion, that and there's like a language gap there in itself in, finding a meaningful operationalization of those concepts. So I wanted to hear your take on using CS methods for things like this, like using semantic analysis and other things to create models that are robust across contexts to study some of these constructs that are not always set in stone. Like you talked a little bit about earlier, psychometrically validated methods, right? But I want to hear like working across contexts, working across constructs, how you can make sure that they stay studying what they're ostensibly studying.
And as you do that, Glenn, could you define psychometric for those of us that don't have Robert's undergraduate degree or your PhD?
I don't know that I could. No, so psychometrically validated statement. This is I do use scare quotes there deliberately because I don't actually know what that means in a very real pragmatic sense. In the in the academic parlance, this is effectively that this is somehow validated against a scale, right? And so like there's an accepted scale for what stress looks like. And so this as a marker tells us this correlates with that stress scale, which we have somehow agreed is the golden scale, which is a whole nother kettle of fish to get into there, right? But so that's what we mean by like psychometrically validated, that's at least the way in which I use it and the way that Pennebaker uses it. At the risk of being flippant, I think that question, I think, misses the point of a lot of the work. And it's not that you are missing the point, it's that like this is the whole field is engaged in these sorts of things. Like how do we approach how do we make sure that we're studying beauty and that we all agree what beauty is, for example? And it actually misses what I think is a much bigger and more interesting question, which is how is this useful for X? And so I'm a pragmatist through and through. And so I have, there is great utility in being able to agree that you and I are studying the same thing if we're talking about beauty. But the way that there's a lot of energy that can go into that. And so the way in which I've preferred to approach this is to say, what's the outcome that we want to achieve? I want to improve your scale, your ability to sleep, right? I want to improve your sleep score according to this measure. So now we've agreed on a measure, we've agreed on a KPI, regardless of the stuff underneath it. We've agreed on how we're going to measure if we've been successful. And that lets us obviate a bunch of the stuff in the middle that has been this traditionally very, very difficult. And I say that like I'm flippantly not answering your question because it's really hard and I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it reliably. The place where we have had some great success there is that language seems to have some portability. Something about language itself that is meaningful and it's sort of that shifts through context. And it's not perfect, right? Posting on Twitter is not the same entirely as posting on Facebook. It's not the same as posting on Reddit. It's not the same as your text comms. But there's some pieces in between those that are similar. And so what we've approached this is to, rather than try to assume that we're going to have fully robust models of emotion this particular way in which defining emotion across all contexts, the way in which we've approached this is to say, here's the outcome that we want. And here's the rough construct, the rough sorts of thing that seems to be working across these media, and use that as a stand-in for, can we actually represent what the psychometrically validated version of anger is? Is that helpful? Does that make some sense there?
Yeah, the reason I asked was because I actually cited a lot of Pennebaker's work and some work that I did in my last internship as an undergrad. And I was just like curious because I had to kind of make a judgment call about, am I evaluating PTSD or am I evaluating trauma kind of thing, right? So yes. I just wanted to hear your like approach, because it seems like you're publishing, but you're also taking a very pragmatic approach as to like, just improving lives, which was, something I'm really interested in, like walking that line.
I appreciate that. It's a great spot to be in. And actually you've hit on the fundamental problem, especially in mental health and well-being. Is post-traumatic stress one thing? Is it three things? Depression, especially, right? There's all these different ways we can approach depression. What is it? It's a symptom that's reflective of some biological processes. It's actually a whole bunch of biological processes, and like, how are they all disconnected and how are they personalized? And so this is exactly the debate that I wish that we could avoid, but we can't, given the way in which we've studied this traditionally, because it really is. Is depression really the thing that we care about? Is really understanding, are we studying the same part of depression really the important question? Or is the question based on data, how do I tell you what the way to fix this is to improve your life, to enrich your life? And so I try to jump over this whole thing in the middle because there's so much energy that can go into these things. And it's critically important if you're talking about insurance, if you're talking about, working with the rest of the academic field, but there's also a lot of good work that you can do if you just skip that from my perspective. That's a bit inflammatory and controversial, and I hope you'll forgive me for that, but a great question. Thank you.
So Glenn, Robert is one of our aligned Masters in Computer Science students. That's, for those of you that don't know what the program is, it's where you can come back having done any undergraduate degree. So Christopher, we're waiting for you. You can come back after doing any undergraduate degree and do a Master's in Computer Science, and we get you up to speed. So it's for people who don't have computer science degrees. Glenn, I think you ought to tap Robert as a future employee, given the unique combination of the things that he's studied. So I'll leave it to the two of you. Diana, you want to turn on your camera and unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Carla. So my background is more in the social sciences, and as we're going into virtual holiday seasons and talking to older folks who don't really understand mental health or have a completely, want to say, stigmatizing view of it, do you feel that your technology and research is also trying to help destigmatize mental health in general?
I would love to say yes. It's not clear that we're doing that successfully. We do. Destigmatization is really interesting, right? I don't think that our research is doing things directly there, but we are capturing it as it's happening. And so like there is great and hard work that is being done by the lived experience community who are being more willing to talk about their experiences. And the more frequent, there's a snowball effect that's happening. And the pandemic has sort of amplified this, where people are much more willing to talk about their experiences with mental health and well-being now than they were a year ago. And even then, that was better than 5 years prior. And so since we started all this work, I've watched this transformation where we never used to talk, like, what's the weighted blankets? This is a thing, right? This is a thing that everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about. But if I had said that 5 years ago, no one would have said a word. It's not that that is a new concept, it's that it's a product that made it into the consumer consciousness. So there has been this beautiful arc of things, of sort of destigmatization that I don't think I can take any credit for in all of our work, frankly. There is one piece of this, one thing we are doing is helping to measure some of that. And so I work with the Quell Foundation, which does some work. They have a movie or two. I don't remember if the second one is out yet, but looking at mental health and well-being and stigma and destigmatizing. And so trying to understand how storytelling can be used to reduce stigma. And they're approaching this in a very quantitative way. I'm not going to give away the punchline because the paper is not out yet, but they found there's some really interesting stuff there. And so we're supporting work in that space, but I don't know that any of the research that we've done is really core to that. It's more I'm pleasantly along for the ride for that movement. And I'm really happy to be seeing it because it's, I mean, as we said earlier, right, it's differentially capable rather than debilitating, especially if done right. Great question. Thanks, Dana.
Completely selfishly, can you tell me the name of the foundation that supported movies? I want to let my son, who's trying to make movies to destigmatize mental illness. What's it called? The Quell Foundation?
Yeah, the Quell Foundation. Yeah, if you think that, I didn't know that that's what your son is up to these days. If you don't think that, I'll take a note as soon as you said that to make an introduction.
Yeah. I already told him to reach out to you about this because he's in the middle of fundraising for his thesis. I was like, oh, you should hit up Glenn. And that'll bring me to my last question. But I have one more question that I would like Alex to unmute. Alex is on phone, not video. Alex, could you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I'm also in the Master's Aligned program. Yeah, it's awesome so far. But my question is, with the rise of awareness on potential dangers of social media from documentaries like The Social Dilemma on Netflix and emerging fields like surveillance capitalism, do you see your technology being scalable or adapted to fit those kind of really, really large platforms? Or do you really only see it being offered to individuals on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, so I have to admit, maybe I shouldn't admit this publicly. I have not yet watched The Social Dilemma. Turns out with young kids at home, I just can't sit down long enough to do anything. But I garnered roughly what it is, and I think it aligns with generally with the way in which we think about these things. But I'm going to not quite answer your question, and we'll come back to it in a second. We have decided that there are two ways that we're going to use our data, any of the data we look at. One of which is I'm going to take that data, and if you have given me permission to do something with it, i.e. give it back to you, give it to your clinician, whatever else, as an identifiable person, I will do that. Otherwise, we're going to treat it like the census. And any data that we're looking at, that collected from public social media or anything else, anything we're looking at, we're only going to report things at like a census tract type level. where you cannot get back to an individual identifiable piece of information. And so this lets us do some interesting stuff in the middle here, right? We can actually look at a population level. And so one of the papers that's going to come out tomorrow is around population mental health and well-being and measuring that in real time. And so we have the ability to track and understand how events like the killing of George Floyd affected the population in terms of its mental health and well-being, and how the institution of lockdowns did a bunch of things for mental health and well-being, and yet the release of lockdowns didn't. And so what this lets us do, there is a public good. This is a source of public health data that is not readily available. And so there is the ability to look at a large population, which we do. We have that capability. I don't want to process all of a social media platform. I don't need it, but tens and hundreds of thousands of people is within the realm of the possible easily. And we do it for a couple 100,000 at least per day of public data. So what that lets us do though is paint a picture of a public health public health information, allows it to be captured and used to support public good questions. And so one thing we've been going after here, and I won't say too much about the specifics yet, but how does this ability to measure in mostly real time how a population is doing, segmented by, say, geography, is critically important to pandemic response. And so the people that are making decisions about lockdowns and policy decisions and things like that, understanding the impact of mental health and well-being impact of the decisions they're making is only possible if you have the ability to measure it. And that's only possible, as far as we can tell right now, if you're going to spend tons of money on surveys and people are willing to actually take them, or if you have some tech like this to be able to allow you to do this sort of in real time for a large swath of the population. And so we do offer population level stuff, and we'll continue to do that, but in this sort of very strict ethical framework, right? You don't get to go down to individuals. You get to look at groups and populations. And I think it's critically important. This is actually probably some of the biggest impact that we can have, is to use that information to inform policy decisions, to use that information to inform the next piece of schooling that's going to happen around mental health and well-being and things like that. So great question, Alex. Thank you.
So Glenn, I'm going to close out with one more question. And, obviously, Qntfy is a nonprofit, if I'm correct, right? It's a for-profit. Okay.
Well, we're technically a for-profit. We haven't turned much profit.
Right. But you could choose to do so many things. And I'm sure that you could choose a career that paid 5 times what you're paying yourself from Qntfy. Because we all know anyone with a computer science degree, especially one that has a dual degree like yours, can make a lot of money. So in some sense, you're really giving back to the world in a really meaningful and admirable way. But I also want to mention that you also have been a really great alum in terms of funding research and supporting your Northeastern. And I just would like you to close out with, why do you support, I know why you're trying to help the world. That's wonderful. It's fantastic. I'm so proud of you as one of our alums, but could you just spend 1 minute telling us why you support the university? Because of course there are alums on here and we'd love to hear from a fellow alum.
That's incredibly kind of you, Carla. Thank you. I really think it's it's truly my pleasure to be able to do these sorts of things and to work with the university at all these different levels. The truth of the matter is that there isn't another place that I found, right? Never mind the fact that I'm from Northeastern, I'm probably a little bit biased, but there is something that comes from the pragmatic spirit of Northeastern education, training, however you want to phrase this, that feels to me like what we're sorely missing in this world. And so this is a direct quote from someone who is pretty highly placed within our government that we were talking to at the time. If you show me a resume from an MIT person and a Northeastern person, I don't even have to look at the rest of it. I know which one of these is going to be a better fit for what we're doing. This is not a Northeastern alum. He was surrounded by Northeastern alums, as you might expect. And this comes down to, not to pick on MIT, where some people that I love were educated. But this comes down to the fact that this is theory, but immediately implemented, right? You take what you understand, you take what you're being taught, and then immediately you're shoved out into the real world and said, go do. And so there's something really powerful about that. And that's the piece that there's not enough of. There's too much theory. There's not enough people who are actually trying to make a difference. And so that, to me, you can imagine why that speaks to me at a very deep level there. And so I can't be thankful enough for y'all inviting me to come talk and hang out and have a couple of laughs whenever we can do this.
This was
So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
unbelievably
Thank you.
interesting. If I could ask everybody if they feel comfortable and willing to turn on their camera and their sound and it's very hard to give a disembodied conversation, to give Glenn, a round of applause, because really that was phenomenal. So interesting, and keep doing this amazing work. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you guys. This has been wonderful.
Thank you to everyone who helped make this possible.